Hello, and welcome to Ask an Archaeologist. I'm Paul Duncan McGarrity. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ask an Archaeologist with me, Paul Duncan McGarrity. This month, I'm talking to Rosie Everett. We cover a wide variety of topics because she has a wide variety of interests. Some of the main things we'll be discussing are paleo-environmental reconstruction, what that means, and how it can be used to understand things like global warming and various problems that are affecting modern communities. So that's really interesting. We also talk very briefly about her work in forensics, using some of the same techniques that she learned from her time looking at paleobotany and various things like that. And we discuss something called the Viral Archive, which is an attempt to gather together some of the temporary artifacts of the pandemic, things like the chalk drawings on pavements, the support NHS rainbows, and all those various things, which are a material culture from a very specific point in our history, something that would disappear unless it was recorded. And we talk a little bit about that towards the end. I hope everyone's all right now that I've done that weirdly professional introduction. I hope you're all keeping well. Things obviously interesting around here. Got a very small kiddo knocking around in the back of the flat. He's doing wonderfully well. Certainly benefiting from having his dad around. Whatever's happened in this whole pandemic lockdown thing, I personally will remember this as just the best opportunity to bond with my firstborn son and heir. So it's weird to have a positive spin on it all, I imagine, but I hope I'm not alone in it. I hope you found time to do something for yourselves. I hope you're all managing to get through things the best that you can, particularly as things turn even more weird and interesting and tense. I think there'll be more discussions in future episodes about something that came up at the end of this interview, which is what is the value of archaeology to a society now. It's a topic that has been in the back of my head. I've been discussing it both at work and sort of in private. If it's something you'd be interested in hearing more of, please let me know. And if you've got any suggestions of anyone you'd like me to particularly interview, please get in touch. Two final things. Number one, during this interview, obviously we're doing this remotely, so there's a little bit of glitchiness in the audio because we're doing it over Skype. I hope you will forgive me for that. We are doing. I prefer a face-to-face, but we're trying to do the best fit we can. And secondly, you will definitely hear aforementioned child in the background, who apparently is having an absolutely lovely time, giggling away in the next room. Tricky to continue with work, as I'm sure many are discovering when small children are around who do not understand the concept of a clean audio take. Last thing from me is if you have the opportunity to go online and write a review about the podcast and give it a rating, that would be very much appreciated. It helps push this to other people, to get it out there. If it's something that you've enjoyed listening to, other people might. That's it. I've half-heartedly plugged the coffee link previously. If you want to have any money that you'd like to help support this podcast, keep it. I mean, I am nothing if not brutally corporate, clearly, with this indescribably professional introduction and all the merchandise that I have. I don't even know what my merchandise would be. Trowels. It would be trowels. It would be trowels and a t-shirt called the Grumble Clump. Yeah, those would be... Wow. Turns out I'm actually really quite good at marketing. Anyway, that aside, I have a very loud baby screaming for me in the next room, so I best go and see how he is and continue with the father-son bonding. I hope you enjoy the interview. Like, share, follow me on Twitter, all those lovely things, and keep safe. I'll see you all next month. Bye! Did you go through the stress that everyone else had of trying to work out what background you were going to have for all your Zoom meetings?
Yeah, it's compounded. So I lived in Leicester, wonderful Leicester, very cosmopolitan, and my parents are based on the Welsh border, about 6 miles outside of civilization. So trying to do any form of communication on satellite has been interesting. Yeah.
Have you actually still been in work, or are you furloughed off at the moment?
So I wasn't furloughed. So I have 3 jobs. So at the moment I'm writing up a PhD, which is fine. I have a contract with Cork UCC doing like a postdoc type position, which I wasn't. The options were furlough or reduce the contract. So I'm down to like 0.2 contract. It's something ridiculous, like 4 hours a week or something.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, teeny tiny.
I mean, that's the kind of job you could blink and miss.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I was at work. Oh, God.
Yeah, it's really strange. And then I do police contract work, which has been coming in. And then the domestic murder rate went. So I've actually been on scenes, and that's been my civilization. Yeah. Which is very strange because they don't practice social distancing. So I go from my little work bubble at home to being on scenes with like 40 police officers, and it's just like,
Wow, that is an intense way of... I mean, that sounds like an interesting journey to ending up with those 3 jobs. You got started, I believe you were at the University of Reading?
Yeah. So I finished in Reading 5 or 6 years ago. I finished on an environmental archaeology peak, and then realised that I probably wasn't very talented in it, and ended up going into commercial geophysics for a bit. So I did that for a while.
Well, that was with Stratascan, was it?
So that was great fun. That was a really nice introduction to why commercial archaeology is such a slog. It was grand. I really enjoyed it. It was
So for anyone who doesn't know what that kind of thing is, first of all, what is geophysics, and what made commercial geophysics such a, as you put it, slog?
I shouldn't downplay it. It is good fun. So geophysics is using non-invasive surveying techniques to identify mainly buried archaeology. Stratascan also did utility surveys, so I ended up a lot of time when there was no archaeology work doing pipelines in central London, which is not quite as fun. I was mainly using magnetometry.
And what's magnetometry?
So magnetometry is using the Earth's natural magnetic field to detect signals that are associated with buried archaeology.
I see.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's taught much at universities, but it's certainly introduced as one of the sort of first go-to non-invasive techniques when you're trying to... Yeah, exactly. So
this is stuff that you do before you're excavating to see if you can identify archaeology in the ground.
Pre-excavation, but you can do it during an excavation on site. You can sort of build it up, and it's good. So I did that for 12 months, and that was great fun because it was pre all of the big jobs that have been going on the last few years. So we did all of the Cambridge A14, did a lot of HS2. Controversial, but we did a lot of HS2. Where else did we go? I can't remember, but it was sort of big industrial jobs that are now everyone's been digging. So as my friends were digging on miserable sites, I was walking down fields on miserable sites. But
Right. The misery was universal.
Yeah, exactly. And it's equally as low paid, and it's equally, I got made redundant just like everyone does in commercial archaeology. But it was the most fun I had in a year. I was so fit, and it was other. And, and it's a nice alternative for those, because I wasn't very good at digging. It wasn't my natural talent, I don't think. So when I got rejected from quite a few archaeology jobs following university and I got geophysics, I thought, oh, right, I'll give this a go. And actually it was, it was great.
Yeah.
Really great.
So just to go back to the university time you were there, you said you were working in sort of like, was it paleo environmental reconstruction, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so in my second year, I think we got introduced to the world of palynology, and I went with it.
And what is palynology, just to clarify?
The study of pollen grains to reconstruct past environments. So trees and shrubs and herbs that sort of give out pollen during their pollination period. They disperse and then they settle into the ground and they preserve in the archaeological record. So
was that something that, obviously that was something that interested you. What was it about it that excited your interest?
I think it was because of being in a lab environment. I didn't do sciences at school, and suddenly it opened up this whole new world of being in a lab and using chemicals and being able to just, be in a different space from books. I found that really exciting. And it meant that I could still do a bit of field work as well. So I was really lucky. I got to go to Ireland a lot on the peat bogs. And I got to go to Corsica digging, coring lakes. You don't really get to do that very often. So that's what hooked me in, is that there was a really nice interface between lab and field work.
Okay. And when you say coring a lake, what is that? What's that? Because not many people would think of a lake as having a core. It's like, got to eat around this before I can finish the whole lake off.
Yeah. So what we would do is we would sort of trudge out into the middle of the lake. So lakes aren't just water. Beneath the surface of the water, you get a really nice vision of organic material and sands and silts, a bit like archaeological stratigraphy. They build up over time and they become really nice archives for the surrounding environment. So things like your pollen that I was talking about earlier. And what you can do is you can take a bit of machine out, so it looks like a bit of piping, and you can drill through those layers of sediment, and you can pull that out and take little subsamples of sediment, and you can extract things like pollen from them.
Okay, and then you can rebuild the environment in the same way that you would do anything else. That's fantastic. Very interesting. Why did you choose Reading in the first place, then, if it wasn't until the second year that you got introduced to this?
Well, we're a bit of a family of archaeologists. My dad went to Reading. He's also an archaeologist, and he did his PhD years ago, also at Reading. And I never actually thought about going to Reading until, I can't remember why, he had to go down for some meeting, and he said, I was sort of 16 or 17 at the time, and he said, oh, why don't you come with me? I said, oh yeah, sure, I'll go down. And he introduced me to Martin Bell, and I was like, oh wow, this is amazing. I didn't know that, Reading existed, and that was it. I sort of made that decision. I was like, I'm going to go to Reading too.
Oh, cool. Well, it's good to have that. And so when you say you went down on your 17 or 18, had you literally never considered archaeology prior to that? Even though, were you exposed to it when you were little? Were you around archaeological sites? Yeah.
So my dad, he did get us into archaeology as kids. We were very lucky. He would take us to sites across the UK, and he would talk about the work he'd do, and he'd disappear every year. He worked on Chattelhoek for a long time when I was growing up, so we'd see him disappear for 6 weeks at the time and come back very brown and very skinny and having had a great time. But I never considered archaeology as a career path, to be honest with you. I wasn't particularly outdoorsy. I was very bookish. And the thought of standing in a field getting rained on did not appeal. Um, but yeah, when I was making that decision at 17 or 18, initially I was going to go and do translation. I got a place at Manchester actually to do French and Arabic. And I was so keen on becoming a UN translator. It was like the dream job. And then I realized I hate learning French verbs, and I just fell apart. And I just had blind panic, and I ended up stacking shelves in Sainsbury's for 6 months.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I can't do this and I can't do translation. What am I going to do? And he just sort of went, well, I was like, oh, right, yeah, sure, okay. I'll go to archaeology, and that was it. I was my first lecture with Rob Hosfield on human origins, and that was it. I was hooked. I was like, this is it. So.
Fantastic. Oh, good. And you're still enjoying it now?
Yes, I love how diverse it is, and how you can either be very specialist or very broad range, but every day is different. And the opportunities that it has given me have been beyond what I ever thought. You know, I'm nearly finishing a PhD. I'm only sort of 5 years into career, and I've been all around the world. I've been to sea. I've met so many people. Do you know, it's just, you can't...
Yeah. Nobody's forced you to learn French.
No, exactly. I've never looked at French conjugation ever again. Yeah, and it's one of those jobs, and it sounds really cheesy, but like, you know, we don't get paid much. We all know that it doesn't pay very well. But I wouldn't do anything else. I wouldn't.
Oh, that's fantastic. You mentioned very briefly the work that you were doing on wetlands and peat bogs and things. You're involved in the Wet Futures, I believe, which seems to be a project that includes the Humber Estuary, the Wadden Sea in the Netherlands. Am I saying that one right?
Yeah.
And the Irish Midlands. Are you working across all three of those sites? And what is it that you're actually doing on the project?
So I'm actually the postdoctoral researcher for the Irish side. So each area has a lead PI and a postdoc, and I'm the postdoc for Ireland, which has been great fun. I actually picked this up off the back of an old friend of mine. She was the original postdoc, and then she very fortunately got a permanent position, and the position came up. So I'm picking up sort of the last 6 months of the project. And it's an incredible project. It's not just about wetland archaeology and why wetland archaeology survives and how it forms and how it relates to past cultures. It's about bringing that forward into the sort of the rehabilitation of wetlands in the face of climate change and climate policy, and how to bring together communities with understanding their past archaeology and why it exists, but also how we can preserve that and the wetland environment in the future. So it's a really nice interface between sort of social sciences and community-based projects, but also the archaeology.
I would have thought, or I think some people may consider wetlands and marshlands and things like that to be quite desolate, empty landscapes. Is there much use and much habitation archaeology in those areas?
Yeah, the Irish Midlands is an absolute archive for archaeology. It's incredible. It's actually an archive where we found out a lot about Ireland's past through the preservation of archaeology in these peatlands. The conditions that peatlands provide means a lot of structural archaeology, so things like timber trackways, survive in these environments. So that there's a lot of evidence for people using them in the past to sort of live and work on, and that preserves until you start stripping it, which is one of the things that we have to talk about in Ireland, and it's why we're out there, is about that. So the island is a fantastic example actually, because there's this social conflict at the moment. So peatlands and peat are a really good source of fuel and energy. And if you cut it and burn it, it produces energy. And this is something that's been part of Irish social history for hundreds of years. The turf cutters, it's a very ingrained, small, tight-knit community. And in the 40s, that was then commercialised. And peat cutting is now an Irish Midland industry. And hundreds of people are employed by them, and their communities that are based around them, a bit like the steel workers in like Sheffield, that sort of like community base. But peat cutting is A, it's unsustainable, B, it's really bad for the environment, and C, it stops Ireland as a whole committing to their global climate change emissions policies.
Yeah.
So at the moment, that's all on a rollback. So what we're doing is we're sort of going in at, as a sort of a neutral level and saying, what we can do for you is, yes, we actually support the end of peat cutting, but what we want to show you is how you can use your wetlands for different aspects of community life.
That's a really interesting project. Yeah,
it's great. It's really good, and it means I get to go out on bogs and I get to stand in my wellies and I get to talk to people about why they're such an incredible environment.
That's interesting. You seem to have a couple of projects that you've been involved with where you're using your archaeological understanding and your paleo-environmental understanding to try and draw parallels with the modern world. I believe you were involved in some sort of study with Doggerland. And
yeah.
Was that related in some way with impacts of global warming or things like that? That was my understanding of it. First of all, if you'd like to explain what Doggerland is as well, that might help.
So we'll go from Ireland now to the other side of the UK and that coastline between Britain and sort of Netherlands and sort of the European coastline, France, Germany. There's a bit of land that is now fully submerged, which is called Doggerland, and it's a bit of an archaeological mystery. We're unsure on how it sits within sort of Mesolithic Europe. Is it a land bridge? Is it an area of habitation? How are people using it? And one of the things that was set up with the European Lost Frontiers project is understanding the way in which that people interacted with that environment, but also the impact of inundation. Due to climate change, 10,000 years ago, you get the beginning of the Holocene. It all gets a bit warmer, the sea level rises and the land floods, very comparable to what's going on today, and how that impacts on communities and people living and working in that environment. So that's what that's what I'm involved with at the moment, and it's actually what my PhD is on. So I very, very niche. So go from sort of community archaeology right down to very niche science. I'm actually looking at the preservation of sedimentary DNA relating to plants and trees and the environment on Doggerland.
It was something called diatoms, I believe.
So we're a multi-proxy, so multi-archive-based approach for the paleoenvironmental bit. So there's diatoms, which are like unicellular algae that preserve, like pollen do, in stratigraphic sequences. We've got diatoms, and I'm working on the DNA side. Actually, that's my specialism.
That's interesting. So that's cedDNA, I believe, is the short term for it. Is it? Yes. How much or how far can the work of reconstructing these historic environments help us understand what might happen in our future with regards to our environment, our ecology?
That's a really interesting question. And actually, it's one that I can't answer, but it's actually part of the debate that we have as paleoenvironmentalists. So we've got this huge landmass. Doggerland is huge. I it's a bit of the North Sea. So, if you look at the map of the North Sea, it's huge. and we've only got 100 cores. So going back to standing in the middle of the lake and putting a bit of machinery in, we've done that 100 times across the North.
I'm assuming you're not standing in the North Sea.
No. This time. So
just hold on to this brick. You'll get down to the bottom eventually.
Yeah, not quite, but yeah. So large ships that go out and they take these cores, and they're all within sort of a 25-kilometer cluster. And what we can do is we can look at these cores individually and try and reconstruct the landscape from each of these cores. But actually, we're only looking at a 25-kilometer area, and that's teeny tiny. And the nuances of paleoenvironmental work really come to the foreground when you start looking at cores like this and trying to answer questions such as, what is the impact of flooding on an environment? Because we're trying to bring together all these different strands of research, so diatoms, sedimentary DNA, pollen, and we're trying to reconstruct a story out of very different proxies. So each archive is called a proxy, and you bring those together to build a multi-proxy story.
Yeah.
And actually, it's very difficult. We can talk about how we've got pine trees based on the pollen, and how we've got marine diatoms based on the diatoms. But how do they all correlate? And one of the things I always say when I speak to my students about this, or I speak to the public, is if you look out your window. So I'm looking out my window now. I'm very fortunate. I live in the countryside, and I know for a fact that within 5 miles there are 5 different tributaries of the River Wye. There are different woodlands, there are different fields, there are different environments. But if I was to stick a core in the middle of the field, how would I capture that? How much of that would be captured? And I think we have that same issue and question and debate when we're looking at these submerged landscapes.
Yeah. So
it's a really interesting bit of research, because it's really highlighted some of the groundbreaking work that's being done in archaeological science. The sedimentary DNA, for example, is being developed at the moment, and the resolution and scale of our more traditional proxies, such as diatoms, really help support that data. But we're still only looking at 100 cores in 25-kilometer area.
Yeah, your evidence base you're limited. You can do all of the fancy stuff you like if you haven't got as wide a spread as you need.
And actually, it's about the nuances of how an environment reacts to climate change. If a tribute, so Doggerland is very special in the sense that it has all these river tributaries that we know feed in from the Rhine. But what impact does 1 or 2 centimeters of increase in water actually impact on the local environment? Are we talking about complete inundation of the whole area? Are we talking about gradual inundation of the area? It's not just as you would sort of draw a cartoon of flooding, that all this water comes in and it suddenly fills up like a bath. It doesn't work like that. Trying to pick that out of 10,000-year-old data is complex, and it causes many arguments. But that's why it's so good, because there isn't a straightforward answer.
Magnificent. Now that's one thing that I understand you got. You can model using diatoms, but you also did something else very interesting with them as well. I think you got you worked at the James Hutton Institute, or you had an internship there. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And you were looking at.
I'm very.
Thanks. And you worked, it was on behalf of the electroforensics. You were looking at the recovery rate of diatoms from animal tissue, specifically in the use of for forensics.
Yeah.
So, what does that tell us? Why are you looking at those things? And I'm going to guess this is why one of your 3 jobs at the moment is doing police work.
Yeah. So I like being quite broad brushed. I'm not very good at very specific and very detailed and clever in just picking one subject. So when I left university, I knew that the paleoenvironmental work that I do can also be applied to forensic ecology. So over the last sort of 30 to 40 years, one of the key questions within forensic ecology is how we can use archives such as diatoms to feed into narratives on questions such as drowning cases. And one of the things we've been looking at is the way in which somebody who has entered a water system, either through force or natural drowning, or accidental drowning, how they take up diatoms, for example, into their system, and how we can do that to answer police questions. So one of the things that we've been developing over the last 4 or 5 years is how to extract diatoms from tissue, human tissue, but using porcine, so pig tissue as an analogue. Pigs and humans are quite similar in their organ structure and size and weight and texture. So we've been developing that for a while.
The reason I was interested in talking to you in the first place, and then I started doing research and found out all these other amazing things that you do, but it was your involvement in the viral archive.
Yeah.
If you could tell me what that is and why you felt it was something that was needed.
So when this pandemic kicked off and we were all thrown into absolute disarray, one of the things that came to the forefront was the way in which we started using public spaces to express how we're all feeling about the pandemic, whether it's support for the NHS or children leaving out painted stones to say that we are still here, or the political graffiti. And a colleague, Benjamin Geary, a guy that I work with, we would send each other pictures of the creativity that we were seeing in public spaces. And then another colleague of ours, Matt Pope, who's at UCL, he started doing the same. And we had this kind of Skype conversation about what we could do with that and how we can use an interface that engages as many people as possible to bring together that sense of creativity that's being undertaken during the pandemic. Because, we understand that the pandemic has been very hard for people, not just in terms of death, people dying from this, from the pandemic, but also the way in which it's forced us into new spaces, and we can't see people and we can't hug people. I mean, we haven't seen people for a week. But letting people know that actually out there, the world is still going on and people still have that creativity in them. So we set up the Viral Archive. We want people to share what was going on. And, it did pick up. We've had about 800 contributions so far. It's been brilliant. And one of the things that really ticks into my landscape archaeology brain is that it's not just about the hearts or the rainbows. We can actually look at the contributions and the images of the contributions, tracking the timeline of the pandemic, so seeing how people's personal reactions are changing in the landscape as the pandemic develops. When it first started, we got this whoosh of public support for the NHS, which is amazing. It's exactly what we needed. But as the pandemic became more nuanced and it became more complex, and it wasn't just about hospital admissions, it was about children being stuck at home, or later developments such as the Black Lives Matter protests. You could see that change in the contributions we were getting and the public response to those changes. And we just thought it was we're bearing witness to a very small part of our history. In 10 years' time, this will be a very small part of 2020 or 2021 as it probably will develop. But as archaeologists, we have this opportunity to snapshot that period of time and create a permanent archive of it. And that's what the viral archive is.
So it's sort of a record of this temporary material culture related to a very specific occurrence. So the question, I guess, that's worth asking is, because it has some elements of it is quite negative, are there some people who might want to see this material disappear at the end of it? If this is a difficult time for people, is it all? Should we be recording it all, or should we be allowing something temporary like this to disappear?
It's difficult, isn't it? We have a big ongoing conversation of the ethics of actually what we're doing, and we have an ethical statement, and we've made it very clear that we don't want people to capture, things such as people in hospital or people mourning or people's faces, all the nuances that can make imagery quite complex. And, I agree that at some point we probably will want to move on from this, and we will want to forget this because it's been a very hard point in time. But I think that we have to acknowledge that this has happened, and I think that we have to almost, in terms of respect for the people that have unfortunately died during the pandemic and those who have suffered in other ways during the pandemic, acknowledging their pain and their strife and how this has impacted everybody, I think has to be done, because if we just sort of sweep it away, it's like it never happened, and I think that would be more difficult to do so.
I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Have you seen any differences, as you say, as the timeline goes on, but have you seen any regional differences to response to the pandemic as well?
Well, so this is it's quite an interesting conversation, is that actually what we're capturing tends to be in quite middle-class, affluent areas, and people who have almost like the time to go out and capture images. So it's capturing a very select area of people in terms of wealth and leisurely time to do so. A lot of it's in the southeast, I will admit. But actually, one of the conversations we're having with a colleague of ours in the US, so we have a colleague out in Michigan, and she's a cultural archaeologist, and we're sort of in development at the moment of maybe doing a cross area comparison of how people have reacted to the pandemic. And she lives in a very white, affluent area of the town that she lives in, and she was basically saying that those are the people who are reacting to the pandemic, because actually a lot of the working class BAME areas of where she lives, they're all working. They are the health workers, they are the people still being forced out to work during a difficult time, so they don't have the time to do this kind of work. So it's a difficult question, because what we're capturing is it feels very select.
It might be. This sounds like there's going to be a lot of interesting questions about class and sort of income that are going to be based on the information that you're gathering.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it feeds into, and actually, what I would quite like to think is that it would feed into a wider discussion on the impact of a pandemic on a society. Who does it affect? Not just in terms of health, but economy, social standing, the access, how do people react when they're living in inner city compared to people who, like me, live in the countryside with, 8 miles of greenery around me? How does that impact things like our mental health? How does it impact our economic status? How does it impact our education if we're undertaking education? Do you know what I mean? All those questions that are simple. Can you take a picture during your leisurely time during a pandemic? it opens up this can of worms that needs to be discussed. And going back to that negative connotation of the pandemic, that's why we have to have those conversations.
So I've sort of asked a version of this question earlier on when we were discussing your environmental side of things, but I think it might be worth asking more generally. What value does archaeology have in informing discussions related to our society now as a whole?
That's very interesting. What value does archaeology have? See, it's very, how do I answer this? So archaeology as a subject is a bit of an antiquarian pursuit, isn't it? It is. It's where it comes from, and it's how it's developed. But actually, in terms of, I don't know. I think that's such a complex question that my pandemic brain just can't answer at the moment.
Yeah, I'm reading a book at the moment called Homeless Heritage, and I think they put it quite well at the beginning, I think. They say that all archaeology is a political act. And I'm wondering if our value is in understanding how much politics is in something as simple as trying to interpret what a landscape looks like.
Exactly. One of the things actually I'm really interested in as a bit of a side project that I work on with Ben Geary actually at UCC, and his brother, funnily enough, Adam Geary, who's I think he's a law professor at Birkbeck, I think. One of the things that we've been talking about is the anti-archive. So what doesn't survive, and what's the value of knowing what doesn't survive? And we're actually doing a shameless plug. We're actually doing a session on it at this year's TAG. So TAG is the Theoretical Archaeology Conference every year in December, and it's one of the things that we'd like to discuss is, what value can you find in the things that don't survive? How does perception and how does things like looking at Stonehenge, how does that make you feel, and why is that important? That aspect of it's very tag, and it's very probably not seen as very valuable, but it's quite an interesting discussion.
Certainly is. Okay, I'm going to bring it to a close now. Thank you so much. This has been really interesting. I know we've covered a lot and very surface area. I'd love to be able to go into more detail at some point in the future. But I do have 2 more questions for you, if you're ready for them. Okay. Sight cat or sight dog?
Sight cat.
Okay, straight in there. And no explanation as well, just like walk away. I don't need to explain myself. And finally, you work in the heritage industry, but how would you like to be remembered?
Oh, that's such a lovely question. How would I like to be remembered? As somebody who will always, no matter how far I get or whether my career crumbles, who will always say yes to field work.
That might be the best one I've ever had. Thank you. Before you go, is there anything that you'd like to plug or anything you'd like to direct people towards? Oh,
well, definitely the projects that I work on. So if you're interested in submerged landscapes, look at Doggerland, the European Lost Frontiers project, and the work that I do with Wet Futures, looking at community responses to peatlands and peatland restoration. And if you're ever interested in taphonomy or want to talk taphonomy, just see my rantings on Twitter, because I will talk about that. But thank you ever so much. This has been amazing.
That has been really enjoyable. Thank you very much, Rosie, and look after yourself.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Ask an Archaeologist podcast with me, Paul Duncan McGarrity. The music you were listening to was by From the Ashes. Check them out on Bandcamp. It was produced by me, Paul Duncan McGarrity. You can follow me on Twitter at AskAnArch or you can send an email at askanarch@gmail.com. But most importantly, if you've enjoyed yourself and you think you have a friend who might be interested in the podcast, please tell them about it. Write a review, put up a star rating, let people know that we're here. It's incredibly helpful and much appreciated. Once again, thank you to everyone who has asked an Ark. Bye-bye.